The coals sizzled beneath a slab of pork. Smoke curled into the blue Texas sky. A group of American cowboys in denim and dust laughed near the grill, tongs in one hand, beers in the other. Behind them stood a fence, rows of wooden barracks, and a group of women in gray uniforms watching from the shadows. Among them was her, a young Japanese nurse, barely 20, lips pressed tight. Every Sunday the men barbecued for the POWs. Every Sunday she refused to eat. They joked at first, called her shy. Then they grew quiet. Weeks passed, and still she wouldn't touch the meat. Not a bite, not a glance. She stared at the flames like they meant something else. It wasn't protest, it was pain. It wasn't about pride, it was memory. And when one cowboy finally asked, really asked, her answer would tear the laughter from the air and leave behind only silence and smoke. The Texas sun pressed down like a weight, heavy and unrelenting, baking the dirt of the POW camp until it cracked beneath the boots of both captors and captives. Dust clung to every surface, curling into the seams of uniforms and settling in the lines of tired faces. The wind carried more than grit, it carried music, the metallic rattle of a harmonica from a bored young guard on the watchtower, the occasional bark of laughter from the barracks, and on Sundays it carried smoke, thick, sweet, unmistakable, the smell of meat roasting over open fire, pork ribs, brisket, sausages blistering on iron grates. The cowboys called it barbecue. To the women behind the wire, it was something stranger, a feast that arrived not with cruelty, but with care. And that contradiction hung in the air like the smoke itself, visible, pungent, impossible to ignore. The camp sat on the edge of a sunburnt plain, miles from any town. Wooden barracks stood in rows like silent sentinels, weather-beaten but solid. The guards were mostly boys in uniform, young Texans with calloused hands and dust-stained hats, their accents thick as molasses. They weren't cruel. In fact, they were confusingly kind. One helped carry a heavy bucket of laundry. Another handed out extra biscuits when he thought no one was looking. The war was still on, somewhere far across the ocean, but inside the fence, the rhythm of captivity had dulled its edges. Meals were served 3 times a day, blankets were folded, work was assigned without shouting. There were still rifles, yes, and wire curled like thorns along the perimeter, but the camp breathed with an unsettling calm. And then came the Sundays. They started as an odd tradition, a few of the guards bringing out a rusted steel drum, tossing in coals, and cooking up slabs of meat they claimed were left over from supply runs. At first it was just for themselves, but one week they offered some to the prisoners. Not all the women accepted. Suspicion ran deep, fed by years of propaganda that painted Americans as savages who would humiliate and defile them. But hunger was louder than fear. Slowly, one by one, the women lined up. Paper plates were passed through the mess line. The smell alone seemed to fill the stomach. The first bite always brought silence. Juices ran down chins, fat melted on tongues, bread rolls followed, soaked in sauce. Some women chewed reverently, others with barely concealed desperation. It was the first time in years any of them had eaten meat without ration tickets or sacrifice. The guards watched from folding chairs, amused by the reaction, but not mocking. They seemed proud in a quiet way, as if this small kindness allowed them to feel human again, too. But not all of them ate. She didn't. The young Japanese nurse sat apart from the others, her hands resting in her lap, fingers knotted together. Her hair was pinned back in precise coils, dark against her pale skin. Her face gave nothing away. No anger, no disdain, just stillness The other women noticed it first, then the guards. Week after week, her plate was left untouched. The bread might be taken, the coffee sometimes sipped, but the meat, never. It sat there, cooling, congealing, returned uneaten. At first, they assumed it was cultural. Maybe pork wasn't eaten in her region, maybe it was dietary, religious, political. But she never offered an explanation. She never spoke much at all. She bowed politely when addressed. She worked diligently when assigned to the infirmary tent. She obeyed every rule. And yet every Sunday the ritual repeated. A full plate, a full silence. Over time, that silence became heavier than words. The guards stopped joking about it. One even tried handing her a different meal, a sandwich without meat. She bowed, accepted it, and took a single bite. But her eyes stayed locked on the grill, where the smoke curled upward like a signal. Not of surrender, not of protest, but of something none of them understood yet. They started watching her more closely, not with suspicion, but with a kind of careful curiosity. Who was this girl who turned down kindness in its most primal form? Food? Who chose hunger when there was no punishment for eating? What memory could be strong enough to make the scent of roasting meat feel like a threat? They didn't know her name, not yet, but already she was becoming a question that hovered in the air, lingering like smoke long after the coals had cooled. Her name was Sachiko, though even she had started to forget the sound of it. No one called her that anymore, not since the retreat, not since the uniforms had stopped matching and the orders had become whispers in the trees. Before she became a ghost inside barbed wire, Sachiko had been a field medic, just 20 years old, trained not to speak unless spoken to, taught to fold bandages with precision, to stitch wounds without shaking. Her hands had learned to stop bleeding, to calm tremors, to lift broken men out of the mud. But no one trained her for what came after the war began losing. She remembered the jungle, thick, airless, humming with mosquitoes and the buzz of rot. The men she served with were hungry, sick, their eyes sunk deep into their skulls. They had run out of quinine, then penicillin, then food. By the end, Sachiko was treating wounds with water and prayer. The officers kept promising reinforcements. They never came. Orders turned to rumors. Rumors turned to silence. When the enemy pushed closer, the officers left in the night, left the nurses behind. She did not cry when they disappeared. She didn't have the strength. There were 11 women in her detachment. Only 5 survived the retreat. One walked into a river and didn't come out. Another starved after refusing to eat wild roots, convinced they were poisoned. Sachiko learned to steal from corpses, to boil leaves, to chew them slowly, pretending they were rice. When they were finally surrounded, the Americans came not with bayonets, but with raised hands and canteens of clean water. One soldier took off his helmet and placed it over a wounded man's face to shade him from the sun. Sachiko stared, not because it was strange, but because it was so normal. And normal had become alien. Her hands, once steady with scalpels, now trembled when offered a cigarette. They were processed quickly, lined up, searched, separated. Women in one group, men in another. Her shoes were taken, her hair was roughly cut, but no blows came, no mocking. The guard spoke quickly, calmly, as if trying not to startle animals. She waited for the cruelty. It didn't come. And then they were taken to the docks. The ship was enormous. American sailors barked orders she couldn't understand, but none raised their hands. Sachiko was placed below deck, in a crowded hold that smelled of salt and sweat. The ocean groaned beneath her. She had never seen water stretch so far. Japan was behind her now, a smoldering ghost. The voyage blurred. Some women were seasick the entire time. Others whispered of shame, of disgrace, of dishonor worse than death. Sachiko said nothing. She only stared at the silver ring she kept hidden inside her blouse, a family heirloom once worn by her mother. She touched it when she couldn't sleep. Then came the land, Texas. She didn't know the name, not at first, but she remembered the sky, open, endless, the color of warm milk. The trucks that met them were loud, hot, filled with dust. And the camp, it was quiet, too quiet. There were no screams, no dogs, no gunshots, just rows of wooden buildings and white men with calm eyes. That first night, they gave her soup. Real soup, with carrots. She took a sip and felt her whole body jolt. It was like swallowing sunlight. Her stomach revolted, unprepared, but her eyes burned worse than her belly. She turned away from the others and wiped them dry before anyone saw. Later, they gave her a bed, a real one, with a blanket that smelled faintly of soap and lavender. She couldn't sleep on it the first night. She lay on the floor instead. The softness felt too much like a lie. They asked for her name. She told them. But they mispronounced it, laughed softly, and said they'd call her Sachi. She bowed her head and said nothing. From that day forward, she was the quiet one. The nurse with no name. The girl who refused the meat. The girl who stared into the fire as if she had once been burned. Even the wind here felt wrong. It carried no salt, no gunpowder, no shouted orders, only the dry breath of prairie grass and the slow creak of barracks settling into the earth. At night, there were no sirens, no boots pounding in the dark, only crickets. The sound unnerved her. It was too peaceful. The silence didn't feel like safety. It felt like the pause before something terrible. The Americans gave her more than a bed. They gave her sheets, a pillow, even a comb wrapped in paper. The showers ran hot. Steam curled around her face, and she watched the dirt of a war-sick jungle spiral down the drain. They handed her real soap, thick, white. It smelled like flowers she hadn't seen in years. She scrubbed herself until her skin stung. Still, the shame didn't wash away. Every morning began with a bell, not a scream. Meals came on time. No mold, no sawdust bread, no worms writhing at the bottom of rice sacks. She sat on a wooden bench with other women, most of them German, some Japanese, all in uniforms, stripped of insignia. The guards served food with gloved hands, no smirks, no jokes. Just calm instructions spoken too quickly to understand, but gently enough that she didn't need to. They called it a prison, but to Sachiko it felt like a trick. She had been trained to endure, not to be cared for. The imperial code taught that surrender was death wearing a different face. Captivity was the end of a soul, not just a war record. Better to fall on your own blade than kneel to a foreigner. Her instructors drilled it in with stories of warriors who slit their bellies with pride, of women who leapt from cliffs rather than be touched by the enemy. She had whispered the oath herself before boarding the troop transport years ago. Loyalty until death. No exceptions, no softness. But this place disobeyed everything she had been promised. The Americans didn't laugh when she flinched. They didn't leer when she walked past. One of them, a guard with sunburned cheeks and eyes the color of lake water, once picked up a book she dropped. He handed it to her with a nod. She didn't even know if he knew who they were supposed to be to each other. Enemy or something else? And yet, each kindness felt like a deeper wound. She didn't trust the food at first. She ate with slow, deliberate bites, half expecting bitterness or poison. But nothing came. Only flavor. Oil and salt and meat she didn't recognize but could feel healing her bones. Her body betrayed her faster than her mind, gaining weight, growing color in her cheeks again. When she caught her reflection in the washroom mirror, she winced. She looked like someone alive. That was the most dangerous thing of all. The fence that circled the camp was tall, threaded with barbed wire, the posts sunk deep in concrete. But inside it there was a strange softness. They could walk between barracks without escort. They could read. They could even laugh, if they remembered how. The Americans allowed letters home. Sachiko had not written hers. Not yet. What could she say? That the enemy treated her with dignity? That she slept in sheets while her country burned? Some women started folding their clothes carefully again. Others planted small flowers near the barrack walls, coaxed up from seeds handed out by guards who only smiled and pointed to the soil. Life was returning, subtly, terrifyingly. Not because the camp was paradise. It wasn't. But because it contradicted everything they thought they knew. Each morning, Sachiko woke to sun through slats of wooden planks, and she wondered if she was still asleep. In war, pain had been proof of purpose. Here, there was no pain, only routine. The myth she carried, that comfort was weakness, began to fray. And in its place, a different question took root, one she dared not speak aloud. If the Americans were not monsters, then who had lied to her? And what else had they lied about? Every Sunday, as if pulled by a hidden thread, the camp shifted. The usual routines softened. Chores were finished early. Work detail was shortened. By mid-morning, the air changed, thickened with heat, with the low murmur of anticipation, and then, unmistakably, with smoke. It began as a curl above the mess yard, then blossomed into a full scent that seemed to stretch across the fence line and seep into every barrack. Barbecue. The Americans were cooking again. The guards called it Sunday supper, but it was more than a meal. It was ceremony. Cowboys in tan uniforms and dusty boots rolled out makeshift grills fashioned from oil drums and scrap iron. They carried crates of meat like treasure, dragging coolers across the dirt with grunts and jokes tossed between them. Some wore wide-brimmed hats. Others had rolled sleeves revealing sunburned arms. Their rifles were slung loosely, forgotten in favor of tongs and spatulas. They were soldiers, yes, but on Sundays they became something else, hosts. A few even played harmonica, their songs drifting over the clang of tools and the crackle of firewood. One had a guitar, its strings old and slightly out of tune, but he strummed anyway. The tunes were unfamiliar to Sachiko, American folk songs, stitched with twang and longing. The prisoners gathered near, drawn not by force, but by scent and curiosity. The smoke carried more than meat. It carried the strange aroma of normalcy. The Germans were the first to embrace it. They laughed, elbowed one another, mimed hunger exaggeratedly. They lined up without prompting, held out their trays with practiced ease. Some guards tried broken German. Essen, gut, ja? The women laughed, nodded, responded in halting English. Potatoes, corn, beans, ribs, sauce that stained their fingers. Coca-Cola poured from tin cans, a picnic inside a prison. Even some of the Japanese women eventually joined in, hesitant but unable to resist. Meat was meat. Laughter was rare. They wanted both. But not Sachiko. She stood apart, always. Each week her plate was passed to her and accepted politely. She bowed, she thanked them softly, and then she sat alone, untouched food growing cold before her. The guards noticed. The prisoners noticed. But no one said anything, at first. One Sunday, a young cowboy with a crooked smile and a shirt soaked in sweat leaned toward her and held up a plate. "Good stuff," he said, tapping the brisket with his fork. "You'll like it. Real soft." She bowed again, eyes lowered. "No, thank you." Her English was quiet but clear. He blinked, surprised. She didn't look angry, just distant. The next Sunday she refused again, and again, and again. The others had begun to associate barbecue with comfort, with generosity, with the strange, unreal sweetness of captivity. But for Sachiko, the smell twisted in her throat like smoke from a fire she had once escaped. Every time she saw the flames licking at fat, every time she heard the sizzle, something behind her eyes shuttered closed. Her hands would curl in her lap. Her mouth would tighten. Her hunger never showed, only her silence did. She would sit just within sight of the grill, never close enough to feel its heat, always close enough to smell it. And her eyes, those dark, still eyes, would lock on the fire like it held a secret only she could understand. The other women started to whisper. Some speculated she was ill. Others thought she resented the Americans. A few called her proud, but no one really knew, because Sachiko never explained, and no one asked. Her silence became a presence of its own, a ghost sitting at the edge of every Sunday feast, a question wrapped in barbed wire and smoke. And still, every week they handed her a plate, and every week she handed it back. It was the quietest guard who finally asked. He wasn't one of the loud ones, not the guitar player or the boy with the harmonica. He didn't joke or flirt. He just watched. His name tag read Ellis, and he moved like someone raised by stillness, gentle with the trays, careful with his boots on gravel. One afternoon, long after the embers had faded and the camp returned to its weekday rhythm, he saw her sitting alone outside the infirmary, mending a frayed sleeve. He crouched beside her and didn't say much at first, just offered a tin of lemon candies from his pocket. She took one, out of politeness, and they sat together in the heat. Eventually he asked softly, "Why don't you eat with the others?" His voice wasn't accusing. It wasn't curious like the others. It was something closer to concern. Sachiko stared at the dust a long time before answering, and then, in a voice so low it might have been mistaken for the wind, she told him. She didn't give him every detail. She didn't say the names. But the picture formed in pieces, each word dragged up from a place so deep she had nearly buried it herself. It began during the final collapse, the weeks when the retreat turned into something feral. Her unit had run out of rations days before the surrender. Men went mad with hunger. Discipline shattered. Orders stopped. They marched through villages already bled dry by occupation, finding nothing but burned fields and empty wells. One night they passed a clearing where smoke rose from a soldier's fire. The scent caught her before the sight did, familiar, greasy, sweet like pork. But there were no pigs. There hadn't been for months. She remembered the screams. They had come from the jungle. A woman, native to the island, dragged from her hut. She remembered the silence afterward, the kind that settles not because peace has come, but because everything that made noise is gone. She remembered the soldiers sitting around the fire, chewing slowly, eyes glassy, not meeting each other's gaze. The next morning she vomited in the bushes. For days after she couldn't eat, not rice, not leaves, not anything that had touched fire. Every time she smelled roasted meat, her throat closed. Sachiko didn't say the word aloud. She didn't need to. Ellis understood. His face turned pale, then still. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask for more. He just sat with her while the sun crept lower in the sky and the wind stirred ash into the air. She explained, not for pity, not for attention, but because the silence had grown too loud inside her. No one had ever asked before. No one had ever looked at her and seen something worth understanding. Only ghosts had listened. Now someone real had. She told him why the grill turned her stomach, why she sat with her back to the fire, why the smell of charred fat felt like betrayal, like guilt soaked in grease. She didn't hate the Americans. She didn't blame them. But the flame reminded her of a horror she hadn't spoken of since that day in the jungle, the kind of memory that sticks to the bones, that hums beneath the skin when smoke curls in the air. She hadn't eaten grilled meat since, not because of loyalty, not because of pride, but because part of her believed that to taste it again would be to join them, the men who lost their souls to fire and hunger, and most of all because she had survived when others hadn't. And that survival still felt, somehow, like a crime. When she finished, she didn't cry. She simply bowed her head, tucked the needle back into her sewing tin, and went inside. Ellis remained on the steps a while longer, watching the wind scatter dust in the yard. And for the first time, the mystery of her silence no longer hung in the air. It settled into something heavier, something understood. Bill had noticed her long before that day, long before Ellis sat beside her and heard the truth she had never intended to speak aloud. Bill was older than most of the guards, not by decades, but enough that the others called him Sir, even when they didn't have to. He had a quiet steadiness to him, the kind a man grows only after years spent listening more than talking. A rancher before the draft, he'd grown up on open land with horses instead of neighbors and sky instead of ceilings. He carried himself like someone who knew how to mend fences with one hand while calming a skittish colt with the other. His limp, the result of a training accident back in Georgia, made his walk distinctive, uneven, slow, but never hesitant. He wasn't interested in the politics of the war. He rarely repeated the slogans other guards did or spoke of victory and revenge. Bill cared more about weather than speeches, more about whether the cattle back home would survive winter than about strategies printed in newspapers. He wasn't soft, exactly. Men like him rarely were. But he was gentle in the places that mattered. When the women lined up for meals, he kept his voice low. When someone stumbled, he helped without making a show of it. And every Sunday, when the barbecue smoke rose into the Texas sky, he always looked for her first. Sachiko, though he still didn't know her name, stood apart in a way that drew his eye not out of suspicion, but out of something closer to concern. She held herself differently from the others, straight-backed, still, composed, even when the scent of meat thickened the air. She accepted her plate with a small bow and placed it gently beside her. He watched her each week, hoping she might take a bite. She never did. At first, Bill thought it was modesty, then shyness, then perhaps grief. But week after week, her refusal lingered in his mind like a chord that never resolved. He wasn't one for intruding on another person's silence, but something about the way her eyes fixed on the flames, not fearfully, but knowingly, tugged at him. The moment finally came on an afternoon when the camp was quiet, rested between supper and dusk. He saw her sitting at the edge of the yard, legs folded beneath her, head bent over a scrap of paper. She was drawing, the pencil small between her fingers. Bill paused a few feet away, cleared his throat gently so as not to startle her, and removed his hat out of respect. "Ma'am," he said softly, "may I sit?" She looked up, considered him for a moment, then nodded. He lowered himself beside her slowly, careful of his leg, hat resting on his knee. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It felt natural, like the hush that settles over a barn at dusk. Finally, he asked the question that had been sitting inside him longer than he'd admit. "Why won't you eat with us on Sundays?" It wasn't accusation, not curiosity, just an honest question asked by a man who had lived long enough to know that still waters always hid something. Sachiko did not answer with words. Instead, she turned the paper toward him. A fire, a figure near it, lines suggesting bones, not detailed, not graphic, but unmistakable in their meaning. Smoke drawn like grasping fingers stretching into the sky. Bill stared at it as the light faded around them. The drawing wasn't skillful. It didn't need to be. Everything she had endured, everything she struggled to speak, was there in the rough strokes, in the way the flames were drawn too large, in the crooked lines of the human form, as though memory had warped it beyond recognition. She didn't explain. She didn't have to. Bill swallowed, throat tight. He folded the paper once, gently, almost reverently, and handed it back to her. Then he placed his hat on his head, rose slowly, and nodded to her with a respect deeper than words. From that moment, he no longer wondered why she didn't eat the meat. He wondered instead how she had survived the fire, and how she carried its shadow without letting it consume her. The following Sunday arrived like all the others, sun high, sky cloudless, the hum of cicadas already swelling by mid-morning. But something was different. The air smelled like dust and coffee, not smoke. The yard was quieter, the usual clang of oil drum grills and cowboy banter replaced by the shuffle of feet and low conversation. The barbecue pit sat cold, untouched. No hickory, no fire, no meat. For the first time in months, there would be no barbecue. It was a choice made quietly, without announcements or explanations. The guards went about their duties with the same slow, deliberate pace, but their hands were full of stew pots instead of brisket trays. There was bread, thick slices, buttered. There were ladles of bean soup, hot and filling, poured into tin bowls. Coffee brewed in wide enamel kettles. No grill, no ribs, no pork, no smoke. Bill didn't look toward her when she stepped into the mess yard. He didn't need to. He just made sure the line moved smooth, made sure she was served the softest bread, the hottest stew, a full cup of coffee. The rest would be up to her. Sachiko hesitated at first, as always. Her hands hovered over the tray as if expecting the weight of something darker. But when she looked down, there was no red meat, no charred edge, just soup. Vegetables, beans, and soft potatoes in broth, the kind of food a mother might serve a child after a fever. Her eyes lifted, scanning the camp, searching for the smoke trail that always signaled the day. It was not there. She sat, and then, slowly, as if her muscles remembered how before her mind did, she ate. No one cheered. No one clapped. A few women glanced, whispered, but nothing more. The guards said nothing. There was no scene, but the act itself, a quiet spoon lifted to trembling lips, was louder than any applause. She chewed slowly, methodically. The bread softened in her mouth. The stew filled her stomach like warmth after a long winter. For the first time in years, food did not carry the weight of memory. It simply fed her. It nourished without accusation. No ghost hovered in the steam. Across the yard, Bill caught her gaze, not long, not heavy, just a brief nod, a gesture of acknowledgment. She returned it. Nothing more needed to be said. The entire meal unfolded like a prayer spoken in silence. The absence of the grill, the absence of the smell, it was a gift. One not offered with grand speeches or dramatic sacrifice, just restraint. And that restraint was everything. The cowboys went about their tasks without fuss. They collected trays, refilled coffee, joked softly with one another. But none asked why the menu had changed. None pointed toward Sachiko or made her the center of anything. In that restraint lay the truest form of kindness, the kind that doesn't need to be witnessed to matter. Dignity, Bill once believed, came from silence, but now he knew. It came from understanding when not to fill silence, when to honor it. It came from taking away the fire when it burned too bright for someone else to breathe. And so, in the middle of a Texas prison camp, beneath a sky too blue to belong to war, a meal was eaten. Not because it was special, but because it wasn't. And that was the whole point. The paper was thin, nearly translucent, and the pencil dull. But Sachiko wrote slowly, pressing lightly so the words wouldn't tear through. She hadn't written home since the surrender. Not because she wasn't allowed, but because she didn't know what to say. What did one write from the belly of the defeated? What could she send across the sea that would not sound like failure? But after the stew, after the empty grill, the words came. She sat by the edge of the fence, where the wind came through the wires, and began with the same phrase she always did when speaking to her mother. I am still here. Not I am well, not I am safe. Just that, still here. And then, a line she didn't expect to write. They stopped cooking the meat. That was all she wrote about it. No explanation, no drama, just the sentence, simple and quiet. But in that sentence lived 100 unsaid things. Her mother, far away in a village carved by loss and memory, would understand. The ritual of letter-writing in the camp had begun as a surprise. The Americans, perhaps to show mercy, perhaps as propaganda, provided paper, pencils, and envelopes. Once a month, the women were allowed to send a letter home. Censored, yes, reviewed before posting. But letters, nonetheless. Some prisoners wrote of the food, others described the weather, the clothes, the quiet. A few lied, either to shield loved ones or to preserve their pride. Sachiko had written only once before, months earlier. A postcard, barely 3 sentences, but now, with the smoke gone and the stew still warming her belly, she found herself wanting to speak. She didn't tell her mother about Bill. She didn't mention Ellis. She didn't describe the fire drawing or the long silence that came before the change. But she didn't have to. The sentence said enough. They stopped cooking the meat, her mother would remember. The stories Sachiko carried were not hers alone. Every woman from their village had known the hunger. Every mother had watched a daughter waste away on boiled weeds and bark tea. Every night, Sachiko's mother had feared that if her daughter was captured, the Americans would be cruel. She had believed the stories, that the enemy had no mercy, that the camps were places of cold iron and fists. And now, a letter crossed the ocean like a ghost wrapped in hope, carrying a message she never thought she'd read. Not only had her daughter survived, someone had seen her pain and changed. That knowledge would ripple through the paper, through the memory of smoke and fire, and settle into her bones like warmth in winter. Kindness rarely echoes loudly. It moves in quiet pulses, in choices made without applause. The decision to cancel the barbecue wasn't recorded in any military report. It wouldn't be remembered in any history book. But it was there, in graphite on paper, crossing the Pacific. A whisper that said, "She is healing." Inside the camp, nothing visibly shifted. There were still fences, still rules, still war, but something had softened. The fire had been put out, not just on the grill, but inside her. She folded the letter slowly, sealing it with trembling fingers. She didn't write much more, just enough. And far away, in a home that smelled of rice and old wood, a mother opened an envelope, read a line, and cried. If this story has moved you, like the video and comment below where you're watching from, your support keeps these hidden histories alive. The path was the same, worn into the dirt by months of steps, prisoners and guards, boots and bare feet, moving in rhythm through days that blurred into routine. But today, Sachiko walked it differently. Her back was straighter, her pace slower, and in her hand she held something fragile, something living, a flower, small, pale purple, no bigger than a child's thumb. She had found it sprouting near the laundry line weeks earlier, just a green sprig then, barely strong enough to stand. Each morning she had given it a bit of water from her tin cup. Not much, just enough. A quiet rebellion, not against the camp, but against despair. It had bloomed 2 days ago. Now she carried it gently, cradled between fingers that had once pressed gauze to bullet wounds and sutured broken skin. The grill stood where it always had, at the edge of the yard near the tool shed. Unused, but not forgotten. Its surface had been cleaned. Ash scraped out. No rust yet, just silence. The kind that follows understanding. Bill was there, too, leaning on the post, hat tipped low to block the sun. He didn't speak as she approached. He never did unless there was a need, but as she passed, he looked up and tipped his hat higher, a gesture not of ownership or command, but of greeting, of recognition. She nodded in return, and then, with no ceremony, she crouched beside the grill and placed the flower at its base. No words, no explanation, just a bloom of color against metal, a soft thing laid where fire once burned, a gesture so quiet it could have been missed. But Bill saw. He didn't move, didn't reach for it, just watched. The grill, once a place of torment in her memory, had changed. Not because it had been removed, but because it had been seen. It had been honored with absence, left alone, untouched by fire, so that something else might grow nearby. This was not a moment of forgiveness. There was no need. No apology had ever been spoken, and none expected. But in that flower, in the way she set it down, careful, deliberate, something passed between them, a kind of presence, a silent acknowledgment of harm survived, of pain witnessed. It had taken weeks. But in that time, wounds beneath the skin had shifted, not vanished, not healed completely, but loosened enough for something else to live beside them. The men still talked, still played harmonica, still made stew on Sundays, but they never asked her why she walked that path, never pointed at the flower. They let it be. And Sachiko, she felt the difference. It wasn't safety exactly, but it was peace, of a sort. The kind earned slowly, like trust built in silence, the kind you don't name for fear of breaking it. Every morning after, when she passed the grill, she looked at the flower. It had wilted by the 3rd day, Texas sun too hot, the soil too shallow. But even after its petals dropped, she left it there. The memory mattered more than the bloom. The act of planting it, of offering, it had already done its work. A fire once roared here, inside her. Now there was only smoke that no longer stung. A quiet space where a flower could be laid without fear. That was all. That was enough. The notice came on a Monday, typed in English, translated clumsily into Japanese, and read aloud by a translator whose voice shook from the weight of it. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The prisoners would be sent home. The women didn't cheer. There was no celebration, no tears of joy. Just silence. Some sat down where they stood. Others clutched the fence with white knuckles. Freedom, they realized, was not a door flung open. It was a long, slow walk through unfamiliar light. Sachiko packed quietly. There wasn't much to take. A folded blanket, thin but clean. A small diary, pages filled with single lines, scattered memories, and the flower. Pressed between 2 pages of the camp-issued Bible she had never opened, it lay flat and brittle, its purple faded to ash-gray. She carried it like a relic. Not of faith, but of change. The journey back was slow, trucks to trains, trains to ships, and then the ocean, vast, endless, gray like memory. She stood at the rail for hours, watching the smoke from the ship curl into the sky. It reminded her of the grill, of Bill's silence, of Sundays without fire. When she left, there were no goodbyes, no ceremony. But as she boarded, she saw Bill one last time, standing beneath the awning of the barracks. He didn't wave. He just touched the brim of his hat, then lowered his hand and turned back toward the yard. That was enough. The ship creaked and groaned under the weight of women who had been enemies. Now they were neither soldiers nor prisoners, just passengers on the long tide home, returning to a place they no longer recognized. Japan was rubble, streets bombed flat, families scattered, cities cracked open like eggshells. But it was not the ruins that shook her. It was the faces, the way people looked at returnees with quiet calculation. Were you captured? Did you surrender? Did you shame us? Sachiko kept her head down. She said little. She returned to the village alone. Her mother, thinner now, older by decades, wept without sound when she saw her. They didn't speak of the war that night. They didn't need to. Later, Sachiko showed her the diary, opened the page with the flattened flower. Her mother touched it gently, then touched her daughter's hands that had once trembled at the scent of pork fat. Now they were steady. She didn't speak of the grill. She didn't tell the villagers about stew or coffee or the man with the limp. What she carried was not a tale of mercy or forgiveness. It was something quieter, a memory of dignity returned in small gestures, a nod, a change in menu, a moment of being seen. Her commanders had prepared her for pain, for starvation, for death, but they had not prepared her for kindness, for the way it lingered, for the way it unraveled everything she thought she knew about enemies and honor. In time, she planted flowers behind the house, the same kind, soft purple blooms that swayed in the wind. When they blossomed, she would press them into books, into letters, into places only she would look. Her children would one day find them and ask why. She would tell them only this: because someone once chose not to light a fire. And maybe that would be enough. If this story touched your heart, please like and comment below with where you're watching from. These are stories the world must not forget.